Welcome to the semi-finals of Novice 22. My name is Shireen. I'll be your chair. I go by she, her pronouns, but I'd obviously prefer if you refer to the panel as a whole. I'll just ask my panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Zul.
Hi, my name is Zul. Prefer gender pronouns he, him, or they, but you can refer to us as panel as well. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations for making it this far. My name is Shafi Raza. Good luck for the rounds. Pronouns he, him.
All right, thanks so much. General housekeeping rules before we start. At the top of your speech, please indicate how you'd prefer to receive POIs, be it verbally, through chat, or through camera. I will be doing my best to post timestamps in the chat at 1, 6, 7, and 7:15, but also please do keep your own time in case I lose track. I will stop taking notes at 7 minutes and 15 seconds and will intervene in your speech at around 7:30, 7:45, so that it doesn't prolong for too long. All right, without further ado, let's invite the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. Just give me a second to start my timer. Okay, I prefer verbal POI, so you may offer any in between my speech, just unmute yourself. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate is about whether or not the government's move lead to more harm than good, and whether it's principally justified or not to grant the regionals more autonomy. We think that the burden under our side is to prove that it leads to more good and is principally justified. The comparative in this debate is towards greater regional autonomy versus less autonomy under side opposition. So the characterization of this debate before I move on to my arguments. First of all, we think that regional autonomy is the decentralization of governance to respective regions of a country, given that Indonesia is an archipelago, which is a strand of islands, which is quite big, right? An autonomous area is defined as an area of a country that has a degree of autonomy or has freedom from the central or federal authority. This looks like the province of Aceh being granted special autonomous status, and they are allowed to practice their own sharia law, which is an Islamic law. The autonomy looks like practicing the religious law as in Aceh, right? But in the law 22, 1999 on regional governance of Indonesia, the Indonesian law states that the authority of autonomous areas covers all fields of governance except international policies, defense, and security, the judiciary, monetary and fiscal matters, and religion. This is how we are going to settle like what's the difference between the central government and also the regional government, right? The central government retains the authority over policy making in many areas, including natural resources, utilization, and national planning. And under the law 22, regional heads at both province and district level are to be selected by local assemblies and are accountable to this. Provincial governors who are selected in consultation with the Jakarta have a dual role because they continue to represent the center in the regions as well as fulfilling the role of autonomous area head. And the district heads, aka the Bupati, however, no longer act as representatives of the center, and the role of the local parliaments increases greatly with the responsibility of drawing up those local regulations and budgets based on what their local electors want. Okay, so after settling the characterization, I would like to move on to my arguments. First of all, in terms of the principle has multiple layers, and the principle is basically the autonomy over your own community and your own region. So on the first layer, in terms of self-governance, we think that it's their own region and they basically differ from their majority. For example, the Aceh is basically their different from the Javanese majority, right? They shouldn't have to succumb all of them to the majority ruling because you have already separated from them in terms of cultural and politics. Lumping them together is not a strategic move because basically what you are doing, you are erasing the minority group and you are only having the majority group in power. That means to say majority group will be able to control over what the minority does and not listening to their voices, right? However, we tell you that the national government's duty is to look after people and so to cater to their needs, right? Because the regional autonomy leads to better tailored solutions to the local people of the region, especially in a country like Indonesia with such diverse ethnicity. And the central standard policy could not serve best every ethnic in the country. Because I'll take it later. The national government should be listening to the voice, especially the minority groups. We are blatantly ignoring them in favor of the majority group, given that they are so different from the majoritarian Javanese. That means to say that you are not able to cater to them as well, because what you are doing is to cherry pick between both of these groups, and at the end you need to forgo them. They never have a voice, and this is like oppressing them, right? It's not what the government should be doing. The government should be caring for the people, and they have a reciprocal duty to help everyone. And this is why we tell you that the national government has this duty to them, and therefore should grant them greater regional autonomy. But the second layer of this principle, we think that advocating for their own state and community, they are able to fight for they are better able to fight for what they want, because right now they have the regional autonomy and power over themselves. They are able to make decisions within the community itself, and not going to be needing the majority government to interfere, right? And it's also good for the government because it makes decisions that benefit the community, which leads to less conflict between the majority and minority. And the minority, because the minority will probably lose out in such, and also the uplifting of oppressed communities, and the national government is not going to lose anything in letting the region govern themselves, and because they are still bound by national ruling, right? We tell you that it's also good for the community themselves, because their identity is tied to their autonomy over themselves, right? When they're able to exercise their autonomy over, like, in terms of regional power, or also like in terms of politics, they are able, like, when they feel proud of their identity, this is where they are able to get the maximum of the autonomy. So now moving on to the pragmatics, we think that there's two layers to this as well. Number one, we think that in terms of preserving the culture and identity, a region may be minority in comparison to the whole country, right? However, within that region, there is a homogeneous culture, and giving regional autonomy to them benefits the region to enact and practice laws that suit the region and its own people. Because we think that Indonesia has a very diverse culture and culture backgrounds in this region. We think that their way of living is different to begin with. Because the Sharia law, for example, is an Islamic law. It handles the divorce cases and inheritance of the Muslims. This also ties to the everyday lives of the people. So that opposition may claim that the Aceh province of practicing such Sharia laws puts the result in persecution of people under other religions, right? But we tell you that this is not true, because for non-Muslims, they can choose to voluntarily follow the Islamic law or otherwise the existing criminal law. This is how we are able to grant them a greater autonomy. And in the second layer, it does have better governance and less conflicts, because we tell you that the groups of people are culturally and politically distinctive. Therefore, the participation of minorities in parliament is already limited. We tell you that they should be able to run their own region according to their own culture, because when you have this, for example, Sharia law, this means to say there is some distinction between the Muslims and non-Muslims. We are able to prevent the people from the region from fighting with each other and also resolving conflicts. We think that we are better able to mediate the conflicts when they are able to have greater regional autonomy over themselves. Very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that fine speech. Let's next invite the Leader of Opposition to open the case for Opposition House.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep, you're fine.
For points of information, please do that through chat. I'll be looking at the chat because the timestamps are also placed there. Since again we have a citywide blackout, I might get choppy along the way. So if ever I can't be understood anymore, Judge, please feel free to interrupt me during my speech. Thank you very much. I'm gonna start in a few seconds. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, One, ladies and gentlemen, we have gone past that notion that just because people are different, we just automatically give up from the promises of social cohesiveness and being able to integrate ourselves within our neighbors, within our borders, ladies and gentlemen. What we say under our side is that we agree that at some point there could be some conflicts. We agree at some point there could be some disagreements among cultures within the national government and even civilians, ladies and gentlemen. But we think that the promise of being able to make sure that state efforts and state social capital, ladies and gentlemen, forwards the ability for them to be able to make moves and to make policies for people to understand each other better. We think that lessens more the kind of discrimination that exists, that lessens more the kind of oppression that minority cultures experience, for example, and a kind of oppression that even the poor individuals within these communities actually experience in the first place. So what is our counterfactual under our side of the house? We want to forward the notion that every single individual within Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen, could still be able to reintegrate back within themselves, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, instead of following or supporting a notion about being able to create autonomous regions within the country of Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen, we want states, for example, to forward or create efforts, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to create structural frameworks for a more cohesive nation. That means that we're going to reintegrate it to educational systems, to our different policies, to our constitution, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to co-opt whatever it is that these particular minority groups are clamoring for, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this house. We think that's perfectly allowable. We did that in the Philippines, ladies and gentlemen. That Sharia law may be followed, ladies and gentlemen, all throughout the Philippines and not just in selected autonomous regions, ladies and gentlemen, because we understand the diversity that exists within demographic profiles of different areas, of different regions, of different provinces, ladies and gentlemen. They conveniently forget that just because this is a minority culture dominated place, ladies and gentlemen, then automatically everyone would want to subscribe only to that particular culture, ladies and gentlemen, because we think that cultures are also malleable and cultures are ever changing as well. Therefore, the perfect arbiter for that particular culture are not that particular movements, are not the government themselves, but we think that it's supposed to be that individual who decides, ladies and gentlemen, to whether or not he or she wants to subscribe to that particular culture, to that particular ruling, ladies and gentlemen. What am I going to argue in my speech? I want to give you a lot of structural reasons on why we think a greater regional autonomy is damaging not only for Indonesia as a whole, but for that specific region that they want to grant autonomy in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. But before that, a few refutations towards the previous speaker. First, on the principle about self-governance, ladies and gentlemen, we think that this was just narrowly argued coming from the previous speaker. They were not able to argue on what exactly is the problem within the Indonesian government, especially on the lens of the national government in terms of self-governance, ladies and gentlemen, and the members of this house. The fact that you still have local government units within this particular country, ladies and gentlemen, tells you that self-governance in terms of the concept of geography, ladies and gentlemen, is still granted upon these particular communities in the first place, ladies and gentlemen, and the members of this house. But moreover, this is the problem with regards to self-governance, ladies and gentlemen, because it was weird coming from that side of the house. They were supporting a greater autonomous region for these particular countries or these particular areas, but at the same time, they are willing to subject them from national scrutiny. Therefore, the problem that the opening government posited in this debate is to what extent exactly, or where do we draw the line on when the state can intervene in the affairs of these particular autonomous regions, ladies and gentlemen. We think they have to be clear on that, because if you're going to tell us about economy, for example, about certain cultures that exist that the state can intervene and can tweak these particular principles, ladies and gentlemen, then essentially the policy doesn't have any teeth at all. The next thing is, let's talk about the preservation of culture, ladies and gentlemen, and of this house. And they gave the example of the Sharia law, that right now every single individual within a Muslim-dominated community, for example, would be able to practice that. I don't understand why is it exclusively going to happen only when you have an autonomous region, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this house. Here in the Philippines, we have adopted Sharia law in our constitution, the national one, ladies and gentlemen, which means that every single individual, regardless of where you are, regardless of your location, ladies and gentlemen, can have access towards the benefits and the blessings of the Sharia law, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this house, and not concentrated only to a particular demographic, but not only concentrated into one particular area in the first place, ladies and gentlemen, because you have to understand that as an archipelago, for example, you have labor diasporas. sometimes you have intercultural marriages that exist within this particular country, ladies and gentlemen, which means that the profile, for example, of individuals inside a particular community, ladies and gentlemen, it's not exclusive only belonging to that particular minority group to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. So we wanted to expand the promises of that particular law. We wanted to expand the promises of that particular culture to every single person, regardless of where they are. Now, let's look at the structural reasons on why we think it's not going to be beneficial, ladies and gentlemen. Let's first characterize what is a greater regional autonomy in the first place, because we think that it was actually myopic when it comes to the argumentation coming from the previous speaker of opening government, ladies and gentlemen. What does a greater regional autonomy means? It means that you're granting them the capacity for them to be able to become sovereign, the capacity for them to be able to create laws upon themselves, to create economic policies within themselves, ladies and gentlemen, and to discuss within themselves what particular foreign policies are going to be beneficial only to them, ladies and gentlemen. Why is this problematic in terms of the context of Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen? The first structural reason is this. Let's talk about the extent of the policy and proposal, ladies and gentlemen. They conveniently forget that within these particular borders or within this particular country, ladies and gentlemen, different cultures and different geographies, for example, and different locations have different starting points in the first place. The ability for them to be able to cultivate their lands, the ability for them to be able to create economic stimulus packages that would benefit the individuals within this, ladies and gentlemen, varies across all levels. Why is this a problem? We think that granting them autonomy, ladies and gentlemen, does not make an assurance or does not give an assurance, ladies and gentlemen, for them to become as independent as possible, because right now the ability for them to be able to get help or to grab resources coming from the national funds, ladies and gentlemen, has to undergo several levels of bureaucracies as well, which we think is going to be harmful. But the second one is also harmful, ladies and gentlemen, because right now when you have less national scrutiny, ladies and gentlemen, and also this house, it becomes harmful because right now you have less capacity for you to be able to track down different local government units or even politicians within this particular community, ladies and gentlemen, that forward certain abuses, especially in Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen, where most graft and corruption cases are concentrated not in the national government, but in local government's unit. That's the reason why they actually function based on patronage politics, based on the political dynasties, etc., ladies and gentlemen. When you grant them more regional autonomy, ladies and gentlemen, the national government has less capacity, which means you have lesser external observers. Lastly, on social perceptions, ladies and gentlemen, and the members of this house, we think that we have to better make people understand outside of our borders, outside of our community, ladies and gentlemen, what it means to become an Indonesian in the first place, ladies and gentlemen, and the members of this house. What we say is that when certain developments happen to this particular area alone, we think it will always be imbued with certain cases of you not trusting the government because you're giving too much of resources to this particular area alone and not to ours. With all of these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's not a perfect strategy, and we think that that strategy only completely divides people, and that's not supposed to be the goal. Thank you.
And the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech, and let's next invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government.
I'm not audible.
Yes, you are.
All right, give me a second, set my timer. I'll take verbal POI since I won't be looking at chat, and preferably after the 5-minute mark. So don't interrupt me before that. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. In the 7 minutes of the hour of speech, I've heard more, ladies and gentlemen, than actual arguments. Before I move on into my speech, I would like to first give us some rebuttals to the up case, right? So firstly, they say that their counterfactual is just to integrate all the minority groups into the nation to expand their culture to the entire nation. So it's not only concentrating a certain culture in a certain region, right? But they fail to acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of ethnic groups in the country itself. They have different beliefs, different culture, right? And it's each and single belief is unique to a certain culture, but now you're forcing it to the entire nation, and that in of itself is a kind of oppression because you're trying to force a culture and belief to another community, right? It doesn't matter if you're forcing them onto a minority group or a majority group now, because now you're doing it to everyone and trying to brainwash them into thinking that like to having to believe in a certain culture or religion or political belief, right? They didn't even explain to us how it is principally justified, and that is important because this is a value judgment debate, right? If they do not even prove to us how that is justified to actually spread these beliefs from a minority group to the entire nation, how is their material even important in today's debate, right? And secondly, they don't even explain to us how they are able to make sure that everyone in the country will be just willing to accept that now they have to believe in a certain minority group's culture and not have any conflicts at all, right? They do not explain to us the likelihood of this happening because people just generally do not want to be stuck to another group that they do not feel any affiliation towards to, right? If let's say, for example, your minority group A, now you have to follow another culture of minority group B, right? Not only do you lose your own cultural identity, now you feel resentment towards the other minority group, right? So the counterfactual that side opposition proposes to us today is far worse off than actually giving regional autonomy towards these minority groups, right? They do not explain to us why it is even better than giving these minority groups regional autonomy, and that is why their counterfactual false, right? Second thing, they tell us that like national these regions already have geographic power, right? They're connected and they already have that in their sense, right? They're already separated from like the other minority groups per se. But it's different from regional autonomy, since regional autonomy means that they actually have the power to govern themselves, to uphold their own beliefs, to preserve their culture, right? It's different from just being geographically separated from other minority groups or the majority community in Indonesia, right? It is wholly different, and just because like they are not literally connected together, it does not mean that they now have regional autonomy and they can decide what is best for themselves, right? If if what opposition says that they're wanting to preserve this national identity, is going to and that they said that national government, like the power, will be even reduced when you have regional autonomy, since each region is going to decide what's best for themselves, not following like the national government or something, right? But this is trying to brainwash everyone to be a single identity, to be a Indonesian, while erasing all their ethnic culture and like their history behind it, right? What you're doing, even though that you're trying to make everyone be an Indonesian and not discriminate between anyone, what you're doing is just making them into the majority group. Because after all of it, right, you're still trying to make them into the same kind of person, right? Then if you're just making it like, if you're going to make them the same person, obviously they're going to follow the majority group, right? And what is the majority group? They are the Javanese majority, right? All the other minority groups are just going to have to follow the Javanese community, since they're not just going to create another single Indonesian identity with zero culture, history, or like background to it, right? Obviously they're going to follow the majority group. And now you're, instead of actually giving this minority group power, which is the most vulnerable actor in today's debate, you're now brainwashing them into becoming part of the majority group. Let me ask you, how is that any better, right? Now, what do we propose on our side? That we say that if we are actually able to give like regional autonomy to these minority groups, right? Not only can we actually help them preserve their own culture and identity, they can actually govern themselves and have a voice for their community. They can advocate for themselves, right? But we also can have better governments and even less conflicts, right? Than what side opposition proposes to us today, right? Like we are able to even prevent like the people in the region from uprising and fighting the central government, which conflict definitely will lead to bloodshed, and who are likely to be winning in the end? The majority group. They have more power, they have more political capacity, they have more resources than the minority group, right? And before I move on, are there any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Okay, seeing there's none, let me move on, right? But even in our worst case, when the policies set by the regions themselves are bad, right, it's harmful towards themselves. But since this is regional autonomy, any person in the region who disagree with the laws enacted under the regional autonomy could just choose to move to another part of the country to avoid the laws, right? This is even far easier than like immigrating to another country, since requires a much like a bigger barrier, right? And even if we say that like the rules that they set for themselves are bad, that is also we still support that, because that is what they decided from themselves, right? The regional autonomy means that you're handing the autonomy to the region is better than the national government setting some policy or rule that will actually harm the community that they did not consent to, right? Now the region is deciding what's best for themselves, and even if someone else like the national government thinks that is bad, it does not matter, since now the region has the autonomy to decide what's best for themselves. And that is what is important in today's debate, right? That we are handing power back to this region, back to these regions and the minority groups, and not letting the national government dictate what they should be doing. And I've been proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Let's next invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for opening opposition.
I am facing a network problem. Can like everyone just hold for 1 minute? I am so sorry.
No worries. So
Yeah,
according,
I'm up. So go ahead. I'm so sorry for the delay.
no problem. Right, thanks so much. So yep, let's invite the DLO to continue the case. DLO?
Yeah, can I be heard?
Yes, you're fine.
Alright. So I'm going to be Deputy Leader of Opposition for today's debate. My pronouns are she, her. PI preference in the chat, or just do it by voice, but please don't badger. If I do get choppy in the middle of my speech, kindly interrupt me by voice as well, so that I'll be notified. All right. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. The goal is this: where is Indonesia and the Indonesian people better off? We need to create and support a policy that somehow asks us that this is going to be a long-term solution on whether or not the sustainability coming off from these policies, the effects on its people, would actually be recognized and actually be having like long-term solutions towards what government actually proposes, right? We think that we have to battle on whether or not the Indonesian nationality or the Indonesian faith will still exist after these policies have been implemented at the very day. We recognize the burden coming from government, right? We talk about how Indonesia in itself is diverse and exists in different cultures, in different like languages and different like backgrounds and walks of life. We think that it's not, they haven't told us like how is the sustainability model of its cultures, when we have so much in retrospective history that when these kinds of things actually be separated, when you put like these nationalities and separate them from one another and create more authority within local governance, we actually see these kinds of things crumble. We have lesser like cohesion for the country, and therefore there's just going to be like lesser help or lesser like for third party harms to actually occur at the very day. We think that it's better coming from opening opposition to maintain these kinds of central governance and actually create laws to actually mitigate the harms that whatever like they pose on culture and etc. What is exclusive walkthrough, and what can I what is DLO going to extend coming from my end? We're going to talk to you and question whether or not devolution can successfully stop secessionist movements. This is going to be on the principle, but also looking at how other countries have said it and how can this be like applied directly to the Indonesian. But secondly, we're going to about sustainability and how the innocent people are going to suffer at the very day, talking about how these kinds of things will actually when this kind of results won't actually be like uniform all throughout the kind of regions that they have. But on how it's harder to have cohesion
Sorry.
on local and local governments is going to be, you know, further separated us to like brainwash these kinds of things. Hello.
Hi, yeah, you cut
Hello.
off for a bit.
All right. I'll be starting in the time step of like 2 minutes and 5 in 3, 2, 1, go. The second extension is that we're going to prove to you how the sustainability model actually happens on our side and how we don't get to suffer like a lot of individuals coming from weaker regions in the area. But also in third extension, how it's harder to have cohesion on local areas, talking about how opportunities are less costly and also how you cannot have like, for example, third-party harms to actually save other people when the kind of local governance is already deteriorating at the very end of the day. But a few rebuttals for the whole government bench, right? They always tell us that during these kinds of opposition that they have, that they're going to brainwash because of the oppression that they have, because you're like silencing all of the cultures that happen, that for example, that exists in Indonesia. But we actually tell them like, how does that happen? When you get to experience, like for example, like there's a lot of countries that have all like other cultures that exist simultaneously. We think that the problem here is not the solution here is not to divide them, but to create better laws, better policies that actually bring them together and actually put them into like discussion and further like and having them to be separated won't be like strategic. But also the standard and culture that they have is already like is already a standard that is unfair alone, because you cannot have like the future generation if it will exist in a long-term policy. They did not consent to it, like having these kinds of culture only be like isolated bubbles from them. It's lesser for them to actually have self-actualization, knowing that they could also like transverse and actually create more connections when you have the central government and you have like a known like a known central government identity at the very day. So what is the arguments then? We think that later in 6 is first is like how devolution can successfully stop secessionist movements. We're going to question that, right? Because as far as like history is ever known, like for example in Scotland and Northern Ireland, when they tried to have like devolution coming from these kinds because of the cultures that they already have while still trying to be cohesive, it only led to more independence votes. It only led to like more like people straying away from the kind of nationality that they had until they were separated, like for example as a country at the very day. We think that, for example, the question here is not how we're going to, how are we going to, like, for example, respect the diversity, but also how to have unity among it as well. It's easier for it to be cracked when you have the borders of nationality, the only thing that you guys have in common. We recognize that some cultures might not be part of like the history or not part of like, for example, not part of like the identity that is usually known in Indonesia. But we think coming from OO, separation is not like a clamor for the unity. And therefore, what we propose is like rather than having that kind of separation or like have that kind of autonomy from them, they would create central government laws that recognize them in policies that add them to the discussion and therefore like create more local accessibility for them to actually be heard rather than be oppressed or whatever have you coming from government. This argument proves to you that, for example, you don't have the sole reason and you don't have the only strategic way of like having autonomous regions to actually respect these kinds of cultures, and therefore but also it's possible for other areas to actually be implemented and don't go drastic to that. But also it's easy for them to feel separated now that for example they sever the ties of the central government. The meta-analysis of this is we need to posit the nationality of like Indonesia as a whole. What makes a person Indonesian, knowing that they have very like varied cultures at the very end of the day? It's not only fit for you to say that, for example, that we need to have an Indonesian identity, the Indonesian identity will still exist, knowing that they have already like, severed their ties from the central governments and have implemented their own laws and own policies with their government. We think that in a region like, for example, that is in those kinds of regions, it's better for us to have cohesion and therefore to like understand those kinds of people at the very end of the day. But how do we, like on the level of like sustainability, we further think that the local governments will not exist in the same disparity, right? We think that there are vulnerable regions out there that will still be maintained, will be autonomous, coming from like the weaker regions. We think that regions like that have the weaker human resource that culturally available to them. Some regions don't have the education level that's high. They don't exist in like the same manpower as like those in the central government, and therefore cannot support their local industries. They struggle to stabilize the kind of development that they had, and will only be costly when you don't have like the central government to actually open more opportunities for them to have the resource income. But lastly, and shortly, we think that, for example, it's harder to have cohesion knowing that the kind of political affiliation that exists in regions can also be varying for the central government. Talking about, it's lesser for them to actually bow down to a central government and have like a say in the kind of like outcry that the people have. When you have like, for example, you don't have a tangible government to exist in the first place, it's harder for progressive policies to exist in conservative areas, and therefore it affects the kind of livelihood and the quality of life that exists in people. You don't get the same amount of resources, you don't get the same amount of opportunities at the very beginning. And for all these reasons and more, very happy to oppose. Thanks.
I thank the DLO for that speech and everyone for a top half. Let's next invite the member of government to open the closing half.
Can I begin?
Yeah.
Okay, so I will be taking my POIs through chat. And I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so good morning. As the closing government, I would like to begin with a few rebuttals. Then we will get into a few arguments that the opposition has not, and the opening government has not analyzed further. So to begin, the opposition paints a very rosy picture of a country with lots of diversity, with people with opposing ideas and views, and where a government can cater to different needs with no problem at all, and people with opposing views are living in complete harmony and just sharing their ideas. Well, when you look at the real world, that is actually not possible, because we don't live in a utopia. When there is complete opposition of views and ideologies, there is bound to be some conflict, and that conflict can escalate. They also talk about different cultures existing simultaneously and say that decentralization would lead to only national borders being the thing that people have in common. What you don't realize is when there is so much chaos and confusion among the country due to diversity, there is bound to happen a situation where national borders will be the only thing people have in common, and decentralization is actually a way to ensure that there is more unity. Which brings me to my main argument. Now, our side of the house wants to prove to you that the decentralization is better at achieving unity, because unity is the ultimate goal at the end of the day. So moving on to the main arguments, let us first take a look at the scenario in Indonesia. For 30 years under President Suharto, the government was extremely autocratic and centralized, which means that the center had a majority of the power. Once he stepped down, there was a push towards democracy because people realized that they needed a government that served them and served every part, and every voice was heard. Because a democracy at the end of the day is for the people. Now, the people of Indonesia want a regional autonomy. And in the spirit of democracy, they should get what they want, because that is what the majority wants. Now, lately there has been a surge where local assemblies are becoming more accountable and responsible to the needs of the smaller local groups. This is something that the government cannot do, because a central government does not have the ability to understand the nuances of different social groups when there are so many of them and so many intricacies and nuances that exist, which would make it, if not difficult, at least impossible for these governments to understand. Secondly, Indonesia is the largest archipelago in the world. They have a huge heterogeneous population. This makes it hard to manage because they all have different needs. This means that public policy will become too complex because it will not be able to fit everyone if you try to simplify it. When people have opposite ideas, different ways of living, different cultures, different beliefs, fitting them into one framework becomes extremely difficult, and there will always be someone at the end of the day who is unhappy with what is happening around them. When this situation arises, there is going to be conflict, and the only way to make that, to solve that, is to cater to different needs, which can be done by making local authorities and local bodies which will take care of individual needs, making the burden lighter on the central government, as well as helping people follow their own culture without any opposition. The government services will hence be delivered more efficiently and effectively. Even a majority of the people outside the Java community want to be decentralized, which is why it is important to take into account that most people in Indonesia want this to happen. Now let's look at the flip side. If there's one government and too many different regions, the government cannot make everyone happy. There will be disunity among the local and central government because the local government will try to fight because the local people will try to argue and get their way out, with the central government trying to make everybody happy. It is not possible to hear everyone's ideas and solutions. This will also lead to some. Now I'd like to show you why this is inevitable anyway. There was an Aceh rebellion in 1976 where they fought for the independence of this province called Aceh in Indonesia, because the people of this province felt that their needs were not being fulfilled by the government, which is why this led to a military conflict which caused a lot of harm within the country. Now, if you are able to do the same thing, where you're able to decentralize the government in such a way that the regions are separated and their needs are catered to without military conflict, it will result in a lot of people being happier. Because as you can see, it is inevitable for people to reach a situation where they finally stand up for what they believe in. This can also lead to conflict resolution. People with different backgrounds have no way to ensure 100% harmony when people have opposing views. Now, having decentralized government will promote the idea of live and let live. People with different religious, ethnic, and social cultural elements will not be forced into one single ideology, and hence will be able to come up with their own sets of norms that they follow. However, it is important to note that the central government will retain control over international politics, defense, national security, judiciary, monetary, and fiscal policy. This is also subject to further discussion, and it will not follow the status quo, which is better because it will take into account the nuances of the situation. This could also help international conflict, because if Indonesia is so split up, and if you're forced into being under one central government, there will be so much chaos and confusion within the country that the country will be more vulnerable to external threats, and from an economic point of view as well. However, if you have a scenario where there is one central government controlling things such as matters of national security and judiciary and monetary policies, when you have smaller governments that focus more on a cultural and social aspects of the communities that thrive in Indonesia, it will be a lot more efficient, as you will have the different needs of the people catered to, as well as you will have a situation where there is harmony among the different unities, which is why there will be a sense of unity, belonging, as well as peace within the country. And hence we believe that it is better for the country to have regional autonomy instead of one strong central government which does not understand the needs of different people. Thank you.
I thank the member of government for that speech. Before we invite the next speaker, could one of the panelists help me put the timestamps in the chat for the next speaker, because my phone died?
Yeah, I can do it.
All right, great, thanks so much. Yeah, so thank you, member of government, for that speech. Let's invite the member of opposition to open closing opposition house.
Yeah, hi. Am I visible to everybody? Am I audible as well?
Yes, you are.
Fantastic. Just give me 20 seconds. Let me set my timer and I will begin henceforth. Yeah. Very well. Okay. Fantastic. Well, starting my speech in... Oh, wait. Shit. Yeah, fine. Cool. Yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right, panel, let's talk about what the debate has been as of now, right? Where both sides of the opening opposition and the government have basically talked about what is good for those communities in isolation. But understand, we are talking about as the government of Indonesia, right? We have to talk about what is good for the nation as a whole rather than individual tendencies and individual communities, right? And that is something which we believe has not been addressed accurately, which we will do for you. What has opening government done for you? They basically talked about the fact that majority will dominate over minority, which is a reasonable concern. We believe that, we agree, but we don't believe secessionistic tendencies is the best option. We will provide you a counterfactual as to why we will sort of remove that harm in the first place, right? And yeah, again, basically they talk about the pride of identity and then be able to fight for what they want. We also will provide that through our counter model. Now, what is the opening opposition to do? They talk about, again, importance to culture. They talk about basically red tapeism and politics, and they talk about the ethical aspect of it. Agreed, that is important, but it is, again, it is not grounded, right? You can't debate ethics and in the ultimate effect of it. Good, it's right, but we will tell you the impact of things. We'll give you more realistic arguments, which definitely will take precedence over opening opposition. Thirdly, the closing government basically talks about the potential for conflict, the potential for efficiency, right? Which we will, and they talk about preserving diversity. We will rebut those arguments because we believe that secessionism, again, is not the best alternative. We will provide you a best alternative. Now, what does our speech basically look about, right? We basically talk about what is the real impact of when you sort of create this precedent where, again, if we have a problem, rather than sort of trying and solving it together collectively, we will give you an alternative where you have your own state and you can have your politics whichever way you want. Like that's not done, right? Because if only the center has supremacy in war and some other very minor and irrelevant relatively relevant prospects, it does not do good for you. What arguments do we provide for you if we set this concept of regional unity in the basically which is a mirror of secessionism, right? Firstly, what does it leads to? It leads to the reduce in sovereignty of the state. Why? Now understand something. When you're creating a division where there is literally a hard line where this community is here and the other community is there, it creates the potential for interstate politics where cultural divisions will play into politics, right? And we believe that that is bad for a nation because it leads to more potential for discord. Because if a state has, because of whatever tendencies, like if that is like Muslim and that's a non-Muslim, they will associate that communalness in their politics, be it economic, be it political, be it related to resources. And we believe that that is bad for both the majority and the minority and those arbitrary states which you've made. That is problematic because, see, what does it do? It creates instability, and that leads to a very poor international image. In the sense, why will an international trader come and invest in the country of Indonesia when it sees that there is so much potential for geo-conflict, right? There is so much potential for inter-party, inter-community, communalist, problematic policies, right? We believe that that is very harmful for international trade, and given the fact that, again, COVID has reduced the economy of literally every state, and international trade is something which is of paramount importance for, again, Indonesia, which is, again, not a very developed nation. Given that, we believe that these secessionistic ideas will lead to a very severe no POIs, do not interrupt me, I will not appreciate that. They will lead to an image of it being segmented or of being chaotic, which will reduce international trade due to the reasons I have mentioned above you. The second argument which is being forth for you is it sets a precedent for secessionism, right? What does that lead to? What does it basically mean, right? If we set the image that if you are not fine with the community, if you're not fine with politics, we will, rather than trying and solving it, rather than creating a medium for mediation, rather than creating a medium of dialogue, we will simply provide you your own autonomous region, right? We believe that that does not lead to unity, which, again, the closing government talks about it. That leads to divide, in the sense it creates the precedence. Oh, okay, fine. We have a problem with this government, so we don't need to talk about it, right? The dialogue is meaningless. We can simply appeal for a new state and we will get it, because that is what Indonesia is propagating, right? And again, when we set this precedent, it increases the propensity for people to become violent. Because what is the reason behind Indonesia being so worried in the actual fact, right? They basically talk about again, it will lead to conflict, which again the closing government talks about. So if this fear of conflict is so rooted in the Indonesian government, which leads to, again, them creating entirely new individual states over, again, just few minor implications, which, again, the opening government mentioned. We believe that that creates problems, that creates a more propensity for conflict, and it creates divide where we have separate nations, effectively separate nations, and that reduces unity, in fact, and we believe that we have really rebutted that claim which closing government made. The third point which will lead to is that leads to even further divide. Why? Again, see, understand something. When we create where we create a scenario in which again, where the majority and minority don't have to interact with each other, where they can simply create a new secessionistic regional autonomy. They have no incentive to talk to each other. They have no incentive to, again, really speak to each other, try and understand each other's point of view. And this comes where the point which the opening government talks about, where majority, again, it conflicts minority, right? This now, I will provide you what our counterfactual is. Our counter model is affirmative action. Our counter model is reservation. Now, what happens in affirmative action and reservation? In the political scenario, in the legislative scenario, what we propose to be a better solution is that you provide certain seats for the minority, for these communities who want to session it just simply because they're worried that the majority will dominate over us, right? What will that lead to? That will lead to a few seats, which will be very impactful in the concept that legislative is dialogue, right? It will lead to minorities voicing their opinions. It will create a medium for mediation and dialogue while preserving the unity of the nation, while preserving the integrity of the nation, right? We believe that that is a better model that will, again, it reduces the propensity for conflict because it effectively negates the point that we don't have our voice, we aren't able to speak. And that is something which we believe is a much better way than exactly creating new states, right? And again, and the closing government talks about self-governance. Fine, all right. Even if we say that a certain level of self-governance can be provided where, a separate state isn't required. Local governmental bodies still exist while still preserving the unity of the state. That is something which can be done where people in very isolated communities, in very isolated statements can go ahead and do that without creating entire states where they will govern everything which is of their aspect, right? And the fourth last important begin that it creates a scenario where people view themselves as more of their own communities rather than as a nation. And what is the impact of that? That leads to, again, the sovereignty of the nation being harmed in the sense that, given the fact that when people have to go to the minority, they are appealed through a nationalistic sentiment. And if people associate themselves of more than a community rather than as a nation, they will not have an incentive to go into the army. And considering that the present geopolitical scenario where China is being so dominant in the South China Sea, that is very problematic because that will lead to people no longer joining the army and reducing the military power of Indonesia, where it is most important, where again China and other players are trying to dominate this geopolitical scenario. And given this, we believe that we have very clearly rebutted all points of OG, OO, and CG. And again, we have talked about how OO's points are important, but we have made precedents because we are actually talking about the ground impacts. We have talked about the OG's point of view, where we talk about the majority will dominate. We have given a counterfactual to that, and we also talk about CG's point, where they talk about conflict and efficiency. Just give me 1 second. And where we have clearly provided an alternative to that conflict, which is again more propensity to happen, which has a larger likelihood to happen. With that, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the member of opposition for that speech. Let's next invite the government whip to close the government bench as a whole.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So today I'm going to focus on three main areas. Firstly, the division conflict that is a very central theme in our debate today. Secondly, corruption. And thirdly, the distribution of funds and how it will benefit the nation as a whole. Okay, so talking about division, right, to address the point of opening opposition, right? Opening opposition simply says, okay, so we have minority in the parliamentary seat in the central government, and that will solve the problem. But is it really going to happen? They never really provide the mechanism, right? Imagine if the minorities are in the parliamentary seats of the central government, it's still going to be based, the decisions of the government is still going to be based on the majority of the politicians and the authority, right? So even if they propose that the minority will have seats, it's not going to actually cater to the needs of those who may have diverse and more niche needs. And so, like for example, right, Sharia law, if the majority decides to implement Sharia law, and Sharia law is going to be institutionalized within like the state or like the island, right? So what about those who may like not want to subscribe to Sharia law? So we believe that on our side of the debate, right, you allow each smaller islands, and I mean smaller state to decide for themselves what are the things, what are the laws, what are the customs that they want, and that caters to their own individual needs, right? And to address the point where they talk about how there will be interstate conflicts, right? Where maybe one state is Muslim, one state is non-Muslim, or one state has a certain custom over the other. We feel that this is not necessarily going to happen, because usually how conflict arises, right? When we see, from what we see from history, is that in a state, when you are interacting with each other, when you're in exact close proximity with each other within a small constrained space, and there are diverse views, and the diverse views are not met. So if the non-Muslim state decide to have their needs met, and the Muslim states have their needs met, there is no source of conflict, right? Because there's not one, for example, the decisions of the Muslim states and the daily life, day-to-day life of those in one state will not affect the people of the other state. In contrast, when you have everyone having a singular law, singular custom, singular culture, those who are having a different culture or law or different preference will feel restrained, they will feel suffocated, and that is precisely the breeding ground for conflict. And what opening opposition talk about is, they talk about the potential for conflict. We will seek to tear down this misconception, right? Because throughout history, Indonesia has experienced conflicts before, precisely due to the fact that local people don't feel that their needs are met. And like what my teammates say, right? The people of Aceh, which is a small place in Indonesia, they felt that their needs are not met, and because of that, their military, they were protesting, they were having peaceful discussions with the central government, but the central government did not hear, did not understand, and that eventually led to a conflict. So we want to really bring down the point where they say any country can just pull out autonomously, and that will create a lot of too many states that have individualistic ideas. No, people who are we have to also give credibility to the local people, right? No local people will just want to split this, be independent from the state, unless they really have true, legitimate, and real concerns that are not met. And eventually, right, on that side of the argument, they have not addressed how they will actually bring about how they will actually address the needs of the minority, right? Because like we said, certain laws, certain customs in place, they are institutionalized across the whole country, and it becomes a very large social norm that if those who don't subscribe to the norm, it's very difficult to integrate into a culture where the norms are simply for the majority, right? So with that, we feel that on our side of the bench, we provide a more a better process, right? Which is that you have decentralization process. Yes, there's going to be this transition period where, because Indonesia is still going through a new period, right, of trying to transit. So in that process, there'll be improvement, there'll be refinement, there'll be ways, there'll be a lot of discussion, right? And we can see that, throughout history, right? Like for example, in 2024, no POI, please. In 2024, right, the government decided to also give certain more leverage, give certain more power to the local governance in terms of how they want to manage their funds. So we feel that on our side, right, there's going to be progress, but on their side of the bench, right, what they are going to essentially do is to just stifle and silence the demands of the local people, right? And as I've already said, we have already torn down the idea that they can simply have minority seats in parliament, because laws are usually quite singular across a country and across a state, right? So now on to the second point, right, that I'm going to talk about, which is the issue of corruption, right? So opening opposition talks about how on their side, there's going to be less national scrutiny with local government, and so there will be increase in corruption case. But they have forgotten that Suharto, which is also the main leader of the central government, is actually one of the most corrupt leader according to Transparency Index, right? So they have also failed to realize that on their side, corruption is really high, and that is precisely why people want to be decentralized. So now I talk about how decentralization will help to reduce corruption and will provide the mechanisms, right? So firstly, with local governments, right, they have their electorate is smaller. They are governing over a smaller land. And because of that, their projects, like how they are going to fund schools, how they're going to fund lands, how they're going to build shopping malls and all that, they are going to be more closely observed and monitored by the local community and the people that have voted them in, right? As compared to if you have a central government, right, it's very difficult to track and to really keep the government in check, right? Because the money is so much. And just to emphasize, right, Indonesia has 230 million, right, people, and it's one of the largest island country in the world. So with central government actually managing such a large proportion, right, large resource, right, it's very difficult to keep the government in check and to really discern, are they like really in power? So on our side, right, local government is going to be observed more closely by the people that are governing. And second of all, right, because local government have the incentive to actually want to increase investments for their own state, small space, right? So they are going to have the incentive to actually improve the place for the local region, which will actually help to attract investment, or which will actually provide the funds that OO has mentioned about lacking funds, right? But on our side, we show that lacking funds is not a problem. Thank you.
I thank the government for that speech, and let's next invite the opposition whip to close the debate as a whole.
Yeah. Am I clearly audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
On that, I'll just set a timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, at this point, the debate has become very muddled, and I am here to clutter that for you. What I'm going to go about the speech is that I'm going to offer some rebuttals which are going to, which will make their case invalid, then I'm going to support my case or counterfactual, and then I'm going to accept all their points at face value, and still why we win this debate. That is what's going to happen. So now let's look at the points that the government has kept on raising and raising. First point is that the local people should decide for themselves what they want to do. This assertion they have been saying on and on and on and on without any analysis. I want to ask them, do local people really know what do they want to happen? Because what essentially you are going to do is that the metrics, the technicalities and the nuances of government is complicated. They are probably inexperienced, unaware about power structures, right? Whereas on the national side, the government, the leaders are experienced and they know how to handle this stuff. So essentially your point of deciding best for themselves does not really stand, right? Now you talked about how you should not succumb to majority, how we need informed decisions, how we need to preserve identity, how diverse needs are not met, how credibility of locals is at stake. All of these points are rebutted by our counterfactual, which is affirmative action and reservation. Building on upon what my member of opposition said, what exactly does this look like in the legislative structure? Seats are reserved according to the population that they have. For example, if someone has 20% of the population, if some ethnic minority has 10% of the population, 10% of the seats would be reserved for that minority and minority only, and those will be elected from those areas where that minority is in majority. So what will this leads to? The diverse needs are met now. The credibility of locals are met now. The informed decision that we wanted to take will be taken in the central government right now because the representatives are there, right? And the minority is not succumbing to majority. The identity is still preserved because this is what is happening in our case, right? We provide for all the things that you call exclusive benefits. All the so-called exclusive benefits of your side are provided by us as well. Now let us look at the harms on your side, which are not there on our side, which was mentioned by my member of government as well. What essentially you are doing, you are reducing sovereignty. It is pretty laughable that the closing government, I'll be taking POIs later. It is pretty laughable that the closing government comes and says that we are preserving spirit of democracy. Is spirit of democracy disintegration and separation? I don't think so. If the regional autonomy movement gains enough popularity, it could split the country into parts. Its detrimental effects two countries' unity and long-term interests are clearly very grave. Indonesia is an amalgamation of ethnicities, culture, which is united by history and national language and political will, right? What essentially you are doing, you talk about efficiency, you talk about catering to the needs, you talk about harmony, you talk about unity. The rosy picture that we have painted is actually provided by our counter model, whereas on your side, what is happening is you are reducing the sovereignty because it's going to lead to more divisions in politics. You are reducing the international image of the country. You are setting a precedent of succession. You are setting a further divide. We talk about mitigation and dialogue, whereas you talk about conflicts, right? Now, coming to the point of collective identity, right? Collective, this is where we have to make a trade-off. Even if I accept all your points at face value, which I have rebutted so far now, the collective identity that you keep on talking about, the trade-off that we need to have is collective identity versus potential for conflict. Even if in our worst case, what is going to happen in our worst case, right? The collective identity might get hampered. There might be resentment, right? What happens in your worst case? Your worst case, nations break up, which is harmful to everyone, right? No, your worst case is not harmful for the local people make wrong policies. Your worst case is nations breaking up, disintegration, disunity. The unity that you want to so proudly propagate is not happening. So this is what we need to do: a collective identity or potential for conflict. And weighing these arguments, the potential for conflict is a greater harm, because what my member of opposition said, that if you simply agree to everything that they say, you know what, things are not happening right now. Essentially what you are doing is, you know what, take a different state, right? So this precedent that they have set. Now, what is going to happen next time when someone makes an unsolicited demand that, you know what, we want an autonomous state as well? Now the president has such been said that you will have to give that. Now, if you don't, what will happen? There are going to be conflicts, there are going to be military conflicts, there are going to be warfare. Warfare is what going to happen if we agree to what your side is proposing, right? The immense potential of conflict is such great that even the point of collective identity, which is the most strongest point on your side, is then before moving on, any P1.
Yeah, so OG has already told you that the central government holds security and finance of the country, while the regional state holds separate autonomy. Why then is the central government not able to maintain the integration of the country?
Yeah, because that is what were going to happen, right? When you give autonomy to anyone, you give the power to do whatever they want to do. They were obviously going to want that autonomy to a greater extent, because that essentially what you have accepted. You know what? You, even if you can't manage it, you know what? Take autonomy. Because, and then what essentially that's going to happen? That is going to reduce sovereignty. That is going to harm your international image now, and that is going to set a precedent. And the conflict that we keep on talking about, that is going to further divide, and that is not going to mitigate any of the harms that the minority government faced. It is only going to create a further divide, a further animosity, a sense of animosity. This is where the conflicts come, and that is what we talk about on our side. The model that we have proposed, since the benefits, the exclusive benefits on your side, which you propagate, that we need to be efficient, that we need to have harmony, that we need to have the spirit of democracy. Government cannot accommodate nuances of every region, as you said. The same thing that you talk about, corruption, that will happen in local governments as well. How is that, and how is that not an exclusive harm on our side? That is an exclusive harm wherever governments exist. That is what happened. And we have already analyzed the worst case, resentment versus states breaking up. The marginal benefit is on our side. The mitigation and dialogue is on our side through affirmative action. The exclusive benefits that you so-called propagated is not now only there on your side as well. And the harms that you propagate on our side are there and on your side as well. So when you consider all things as a whole, clearly we provide a better solution. With that, very proud to oppose.
All right, I thank the opposition whip for that fine speech and everyone for a wonderful debate. You may cross the floor, shake hands, and exit the breakout room back to the main hall and leave the judges here to deliberate. We will announce the verdict and results in the main hall later on. Thank you so much. Zul, I think you can stop recording as well.